In this video, we're going to talk about how trauma impacts our overall mental health. By the end, you're going to see how trauma impacts your mental health across 4 different areas: your physical, cognitive, emotional, as well as your mind-body connection. You're also going to be able to walk away with some safe tips that you can start practicing right away, whether you're currently tackling your trauma or not. Hey, before we dive in, a couple of things. I've noticed a lot of people that are watching these videos aren't hitting follow and the bell notifications, so make sure you do that so you get notified each and every week of new videos that come out. I also want to point out that down below in the description area is a free attachment or trauma self-assessment. This looks at how trauma impacts your life and your relationships across 4 different areas, and it can give you a great idea of where you might need to start tackling your trauma. All right, let's dig in. Let me throw out a couple of statistics for you. Now, hang with me. This isn't going to be that kind of a show, but I think it's pretty startling what the statistics show in terms of trauma. And that is that 70% of adults, 70% of adults surveyed report having at least one traumatic event in their lifetime. Of those 70%, 60% report having an adverse childhood experience from 0 to the age of 18. These are pretty startling statistics when it comes down to it. And I want to point out here, what we're talking about primarily is what they call small t or relational trauma. We're not talking about big T or one-time event trauma. So for example, having a car crash may be a traumatic event, absolutely, for sure. But we're really talking about the most common types of trauma, and that is interpersonal or attachment or complex trauma, where there were a series of events that happened childhood or in your adolescence prior to 18 years of age that really helped shape and rewire your brain and set expectations for you in your relationships. One of the studies that I want to point to the most is what we call the ACE study. It's the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. This was done by the CDC at Kaiser Permanente, and they surveyed over 17,000 adults. And they gave one point to each one of these 10 different adverse childhood experiences that they had rated. And if somebody came up with 1 point, then that was correlated with ways that it was impacting their mental health and ways that it impacted their life and their relationships. And these were absolutely stunning results. This is now referred to as the ACE study or the ACEs because of the outcome that shocked so many people. By the way, the 17,000 adults that they interviewed, these were not low-income families. These were average household incomes. And they still showed up as having a significant amount of adverse childhood experiences. And what they correlated that with was chronic health problems such as heart disease, diabetes, or high blood pressure. Mental health disorders such as anxiety disorders, could be panic or generalized anxiety, and certainly depression as well. And finally, they correlated these adverse childhood experiences to a higher increase around substance abuse and risky behaviors. So this study was really groundbreaking when it was done in the 1990s and helped sort of break open part of what we now know about how trauma, chronic, repeated trauma in our childhood or adolescence can really affect our global mental health. Well, let's pivot for just a moment. Let's talk about these 4 different areas. How does having trauma, complex trauma, relational or attachment trauma, any of those words that we can use to describe what we're talking about here today, how does that impact 4 different areas in our life? Well, one of the first is the emotional effects that it can have. And certainly a lot of people that can report having anxiety report having past trauma as well. Not always the case. I don't want you to swing the pendulum of what I'm saying all the way to the other extreme, that everybody that has trauma has anxiety, because that's certainly not true. But we see a correlation. We see an increase that people that have trauma in their past can struggle more with anxiety. And of course, as you probably well know, anxiety disorders can be on a spectrum. They can be from small, generalized anxiety, where anxiety is sort of always in the background. It's something that they have to struggle with or shows up at certain times and seasons of their life, all the way to panic disorders that somebody can have, all the way to, say, a debilitating type of anxiety where they are unable to work. There's this fear that just permeates their body and can become very debilitating in that respect. So they can struggle with anxiety. Certainly depression can be some of the emotional impact that trauma can have on our global mental health, as well as shame and emotional numbness. Now, shame often occurs because the child or the adolescent was kept in a situation where they didn't have control. And they oftentimes were shamed for expressing their wants or needs or feelings. And so when you're young, you don't have the capability of looking around at the adults in your life and saying, man, I'm not really getting my needs met here. These adults probably need some help. They're not really providing for me the way that I need, emotionally, physically, mentally. They don't have that capacity as children. All they know is that, well, it must be me. The message I'm getting is it must be me. And that can create a serious sense of shame. And I often will have patients come in and tell me that they're broken or that there's something defective in them. And it just breaks my heart when I hear that. And it tells me that probably they got that message somewhere along the line. Okay, that's for the emotional impact. What about the relational effects? Well, certainly having trauma can make intimacy difficult. And I'm not just talking about the sexual intimacy, although certainly if there was sexual trauma, that can be the case. But I'm talking about just feeling close and connected to another human being. Sometimes people with certain trauma, that can feel more dangerous than it does safe. When we start talking about the more avoidant styles of attachment, the way people have adapted to not having anybody in their environment be able to show up for them, respond to them, be emotionally available and responsive to those needs, then oftentimes that closeness and intimacy feels more dangerous than it does safe. We can also look at general mistrust, not only mistrust in ourselves, but mistrust in others. I don't trust that others will really show up for me. I don't trust myself that I can actually know what I'm feeling, trust my instincts, and be able to communicate my wants and needs to my partner. And then it can also show up in sort of an over and under functioning capacity, meaning that sometimes people react to their trauma by over functioning. They take on these perfectionistic tendencies where they're trying to control everything in our environment. Everything has to be perfect for them because that's part of how they're trying to overcome this feeling of powerlessness in what created their trauma originally. Or they could be under functioning. They could simply not take responsibility, have difficulty holding a job. They might live, in the proverbial basement with their parents until they're 25, 30, 35 years of age, never really showing the maturity they need to be an autonomous, independent person. Okay, what about the third category? What about cognitive effects? Well, certainly we know that trauma can have a profound impact on our cognitions, especially on what we call core beliefs. So, core beliefs are simply a deep down belief we hold about ourselves and a deep down belief we hold about others. So, core beliefs might come out as I'll never get the love that I need. People don't stay, they always leave. I'm not good enough. I'm not worthy. I'll never measure up. When we hold these core beliefs as truths about ourselves or truths about others, They often can dominate and drive our interactions, even to the point that we don't even recognize it and see it. And part of what core beliefs do is they become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it can be very difficult to overcome those, especially if we don't recognize the small little ways these core beliefs can play out in our life and in our relationships. And finally, the mind-body connection. How does trauma impact the mind-body connection? Well, it can do so in many different ways. We can hold that fatigue in our body where we just constantly feel drained. We never feel really alive. We never get really excited about things per se. Instead, we always just feel drained. It might come across as feeling tension in our body. We might constantly feel tension in our shoulders or tension in our abdomen. It could come across as digestive issues. So irritable bowel syndrome has been linked to trauma in the past. I'm not saying it's a direct cause, but it's been linked to some past trauma. And one of the things that I have seen is that oftentimes when somebody's able to work through their trauma, they can get to a place where a lot of their physical symptoms can either lessen or dissipate completely. And it's an amazing thing to see where people have struggled with fatigue or they've struggled with irritable bowel syndrome or anxiety. And all of a sudden, as they begin to work through their trauma, what they begin to recognize is that their body feels more safe inside them than it ever has before. What are some things that we can start doing to work on our overall mental health, whether we particularly start tackling our trauma or not? Well, one of the first things we can do is just to begin to get in touch with our body and the signals that it's sending us. So we can start practicing grounding techniques. We can start doing yoga, tai chi, anything that allows us to move the body and to begin to connect more to our body so that we're more aware of those signals it might be sending us. Certainly things like making sure we have a good sleep routine. Stay away from, phones right before you go to sleep at bed at night, because the blue light in the screens can actually be disruptive to your sleep. So make sure you're trying to get somewhere between 6 and 8 hours of sleep a night. I recognize there are people out there that don't need 8 hours every single night. And so sometimes there's people that are just wired away where in 5 hours it's plenty for them. Other people need 8 to 10 hours. So whatever your body is signaling to you, try to make sure you have a good enough sleep routine that you can really begin to get the rest you need. It is so impactful to our mental health to be able to get the necessary rest. Otherwise, we do feel more fatigued, we feel more fuzzy, we feel sometimes we go blank, we can't think of things, we can't think of the words and communicate the way we want to in our life and in our relationships when we are excessively tired. Another thing I think is very important is just hydration, making sure that we drink enough water. Trying to stay away from sugary drinks can be very helpful as well. Another way that you can really begin to practice good mental health is to begin to target some of those core negative beliefs. Do you know what your triggers might be? Do you know that when you get triggered, the feeling that comes up and the meaning behind that feeling? In another video, I talked about trauma triggers, and I talked of 4 aspects of trauma triggers. I talked about how there's a trigger, there's an emotion, there's a core belief, and then there's a behavior with them. So when that core belief of, let's say, I'm not good enough, when it gets triggered, can you recognize how that comes out in your behavior, how that shows up in your relationships? Being able to just observe non-judgmentally the way that might pop up in you or in your relationships can be extremely empowering in and of itself. So being able just to recognize, oh, I think this is that feeling again. I think this is that part of me, that core belief that got impacted by my trauma. It's not all of who I am. It's not everything. There's other parts of me, but certainly this one part can get triggered. And when it does, it can show up in my relationship and it can really kind of send me into more anxiety or more depression, or it can really make me feel fatigued for days at a time. Finally, I want to mention that I think one of the things that we can do to really impact our mental health is to try to stay away from drugs, alcohol, or any addictive behaviors. I know in terms of our coping styles that oftentimes it drives us to want to do those things in order to get some relief of what's happening inside of us, some relief from the anxiety, some relief from the depression. But it actually over time creates more problems than it does solutions for us. So staying away, or at least limiting as much as possible, drugs, alcohol, or addictive behaviors will allow us to process our feelings more and directly deal with some of the impact of trauma in our cognitive, emotional, or physical health in ways that it might mask or help us avoid those issues in the first place. So being able to limit those, I think, is a way that we can really begin to take more control of our overall mental health, whether we're specifically doing work on our trauma or not. My name's Tom Philp, and I'm here to remind you to stay grounded, clear, and connected.